Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video we will try to understand Redux with Redux-Saga in real time, how we do implement. So for that I just taken a very simple example of loading a random user data from a open source API. I will give the link of that open source API endpoint in the description, so you can also head to that and then practice with that. So basically the API looks much like this, and whenever I hit this API it is going to send some data. Each time it shares the data of one user. So one user data, something like gender, name, and then some location and some other values. So if I expand it in the JSON formatter, the object actually looks like this, where we have a gender and then we have the email of the user, and then we have the phone number of the user, and then pictures. There are three kinds of pictures are there. One is large, medium, and then thumbnail. So we'll use one of those pictures to display that. Now if you see, so here is a simple user interface where when we click on this button it is going to load one user data and it displays the data over here. So like this, it shows the loader, and then it displays the picture of the user, and then full name, and then followed by email and then phone number. When I try to click on this fetch another user, it is going to load another user's data and displays the user's information over here. Okay, when I click on it again, it shows the again same thing, some other user data. Now when I disconnect to internet and try it again, this time I disconnected to internet and let me click on it. Now you see we get a warning message saying that something went wrong because we are disconnected to the internet. And when I click on try again, it does not work this time because we are making a real-time API call. Now when I reconnect back to my network, now I connected back to my network, and if I try again, now this time it is going to load the user information and it puts on the web page. Now I just created a very sample blueprint of how we can solve this using Redux as well as Redux-Saga together. So for that I just created a very simple chat here. Now in this chat you can clearly see, so you should know the basics of what is Redux. So in React Redux library, we have a provider component under which whatever the components are there, those components can actually access to the store object that we pass as a prop for the provider component. So assume that here is a user component which is there inside the provider component, so that this user component can actually listen to all the events of that particular state. Okay, now in this user component I am listening to three kinds of properties in my Redux state, which is the error property, data property, and then the API status property. Error property will actually be a string, which will be, if there is any error in the API, it is listens to the string, basically the error message. And then data is actually listens to the data of the user when it is loaded successfully. And API status has four values. One is init, loading, success, error. So init is the one which we set up initially, and then loading is the one when the API call we made but still we did not get the API response, so that is the loading. And then when we receive the response successfully, then we make it as success. And when there is any failure, then we make it API status, we make it to error. Now initially when the user clicks on this button, we are going to dispatch an action which is fetch user, and this fetch user action be listened by the Saga middleware, which is a generator function watch user actions. And as soon as it listens to this fetch user action, it is going to call another generator function to make the asynchronous operation. So that is async fetch user, and inside this async fetch user function we actually going to make the API call, and here is a request to the server, and then we get back the response. When there is a failure, we are going to dispatch another action called fetch failed. When there is a success from the server, then we will dispatch another action called fetch success with the payload. Payload means the data that we receive from the server. Now these two events are going to be listened by the reducer function, which we pass as a prop, pass as an argument for the create store method. And then the reducer, when listens to fetch success, it takes the payload and it gives that as to the data property of Redux state, and then the API status will be set to success, and remaining will be as it is. Now coming to when the failure is there, API status is set to error, and then whatever the error I was talking about in the user component, so that one will be set to something went wrong. And once this data has been written from the reducer, immediately our listeners are there here, three different variable listeners, since we are using useSelector hook from the React Redux library. So whenever the change is there in error or data or API status, our component gets re-rendered, and when the component gets re-rendered, we will show the respective UI accordingly. So in the next we will try to code this out and implement it how we do in real time. So basically, firstly, you need to install two libraries from the Redux. So this is my project structure, which has nothing initially other than app.js, wherein it shows one h1 tag. And then going to package.json, you need to install libraries for the Redux. The first thing you need to install is the React Redux, wherein the provider component is present. And then the second thing you need to install is the Redux-Saga, which is to implement the Saga, which is a side effect. And then third one is the Redux, which actually gives the core functionalities of the Redux state management library. Okay, so you have to install these three libraries, and once the installation is done, you can just come back to here, and then let us open the app. And now you see this time we are entering only one h1 tag, and that is why we are able to see this app. Okay, now what we will do is, firstly we will wrap one provider component around it, something like this, provider. And then for this provider component, we are going to give an object called store. Okay, so here we are supposed to create a store, and then we have to import that store object here, which is our actual Redux store, and then we will use the user component inside it. Okay, so let us head back to it and let us create the store. I'll create a file called store. Now inside this, I'm going to create the store. To create the store, we need to import the function, which is the create store, from the Redux library. And then from the Redux library also, we need to import another function called apply middleware function, which is used to apply some other middlewares like Saga. And then we have to import the create Saga middleware function from the Redux-Saga core. Okay, now once this is the function which is used to create a Saga middleware instance. Now let us create the Saga middleware instance. So const Saga middleware is equal to create Saga middleware, and then we have created an instance of Saga middleware. And after that, we need to create the store. So to create the core store, we need to have a reducer function. So let me write the reducer function here. And we know that reducer function always takes two things. One is the state and the other one is the action. And as of now, I'm keeping these as empty, and then later we will fill this up. And then we created a reducer function, and let us create the store. So I'm going to export the store here itself. Const store is equal to, and this is going to be the returned value from the create store method. And create store basically takes reducer usually, but when we wanted to implement some asynchronous operations, then in that case we have to use something like Saga. Now we have to pass the second argument to be the returned value by this apply middleware function, and this apply middleware takes the middleware object, which is the Saga middleware in our case. So let me just write this apply middleware, and then inside this I'm going to pass the Saga middleware object, just like this. And after that, we need to execute the method called run, which is there inside the Saga middleware object, which is returned by this create Saga middleware function. So let us do that. Saga middleware dot run is the method, and this run method takes one generator function value, which is an asynchronous function. So we have to create the generator function, and then we need to import that here, and then we have to pass that as an argument. To do that, I'm going to create another file called Saga. Let me create that, saga.js, and inside this I'm going to create a function which is a generate function, and then this generator function name I'll give as watch user actions. And as of now, I'm going to keep this as empty, and let me import that over here. So import watch user actions, and this watch user actions I'm going to pass as an argument over here. Now we are done setting up this Saga middleware setup. And now coming back to our app, here I just need to import the store. So when I import store, and then I'll pass this over here. Now coming back to inside this, we have to display the user details. To do that, firstly I'll set up a heading here saying that random user, just like this, and you see we see the random user. Now under it, I'm going to create a component for the user. So let me create a user component, which is going to be another file, user.js, and inside it I'm going to export a simple component called user, and it's going to return some message h1 user component, just like this. And if I enter, and then let me just import that over here, and you see we get the user component over here. And inside this user component, we are actually going to have a button initially, and that button, upon clicking on that button, we need to load the data. Now before we set up that, right, we firstly try to implement the reducer method. So reducer method, to implement the reducer method, we should have an initial state, because initially when we listen to the store, right, in our application, the whatever the reducer function returns, that would be undefined. So on undefined we cannot listen to any properties. So that is why we need to have an initial state of the object. So let me create the initial state, and inside this initial state I'm going to set the error to be an empty string as of now, and then my API status, as we discussed, it is going to be init initially, and then the data is going to set to null. I mean we don't have any data yet, right? And the state object will take the default argument, which is the initial state. Okay, now this function should return the state object. Okay, now as of now I don't have any actions that are being listened by this reducer function. So initially when it called, it returns the state object straightforward. And let me listen to these three properties in my user component. So head back to here and then create three objects. One is for the error, and it is going to listen to the error of the state. So state dot error. So I need to pass a selector function each time, which takes the state, which is a state, this state as of now, whatever the return value by this reducer function, and then in that state I'm listening to error first, and then let me also take the data, which is the user data, whenever user data is there, and then this time this one is going to listen to state dot data. Now similarly let me listen to API status as well. So API status is equal to use selector, and then state dot API status, just like this. Now we are listening to these three things, and one more thing what we need to do is, we need to, based on these three data, we need to set up one we need to return some HTML, right? So firstly I will set up for the, when the API status is equal to init, right, then in that case I'm going to set up a single button which will load the data. So let me return a button, and this button is going to be load your first user, because this time this is the first time the user can see this button, right? So let me just save it, and now you see we see load your first user, because our API status is set to what? Init. As you see in the initial state we set the API status to be init. So initially when the reducer function calls, we are eventually returning the initial state itself, because the state is undefined. So we passed a default argument, and it's going to return init as the API status. So when our component listens to this API status, it is going to return this button. Now upon this clicking on this button, we'll set up a on click event which is going to listen to a fetch user function. So let me create that fetch user function, const fetch user, and it takes nothing but it dispatches an action, as we discussed in the last video. So dispatch, and to dispatch we need to take, this is a dispatch function, we need to have a dispatch function to dispatch an action, but for that we need to use a hook called use dispatch, which is from the React Redux. So dispatch is equal to use dispatch we can use, and you see these two are the hooks that are provided by React Redux library. So that's why we need to install that library as well. And in the dispatch we need to pass an object which should have a property called type, and in the type fetch user is the our first dispatcher. So if I head to this chat, right, so if you see this is the first one, when user clicks on this button, right, so that is where we are going to dispatch this action, which is fetch user. And after we dispatch this fetch user action, we need to listen to an asynchronous generator function, which is the Saga's main function. Okay, whatever the function that we registered in the run method, which is watch user action, and that should listen to it. So to listen to it, we need to take an effect, which is the take every from, let me import that, take every, and that should be from Redux-Saga effects. So there is a file called fx inside Redux-Saga library, and it is going to export this take every method, and take every will just listen to all the events that are being dispatched by the component. Now let me just write the event over here. So it takes every, so yield take every, and inside it is going to listen to which action? The fetch user action. So when the fetch user action is listened by this function, it has to call an asynchronous fetch user function, async fetch user, and it is going to be another function which is a generator function, because asynchronous operations we are going to do. So function generator function it is, so async fetch user, and it takes nothing and it does something. So it is going to make the API call actually here, right? And after it receives an API call, it is going to dispatch another action so that the reducer will listen to it, and then we will load the data onto the users page, users component. Now let us head to this Saga and then try to build it. Before that, let us see the chart, how we are going to do this. So if you see, after our watch user actions is going to listen to this fetch user, it's going to call another function, and in this function we should make an API call, and then based on the API call response, we have to dispatch either fetch success or fetch failed. Now let us do the API call dispatch here, API call here inside. For doing that, I'm going to use a try catch block because there may be failures, and the failures I'll be capturing into the catch. Okay, it's going to capture an error. Now inside this, I'm going to create a variable called response, and response is yield fetch, and inside this we should give the URL or the endpoint. So let me just copy this endpoint and let me just keep it here inside a string. And then once we make this API call, right, we get some response, and based on the response we have to take an action here. So if response is success, that means response.ok is true, then what we'll have to do, we'll have to dispatch another action, which is the fetch success. Else what we'll do is we'll throw some error, which is the response object only. Okay, so whenever we throw this, right, sorry, it should be response. Whenever we throw this error, right, it is going to captured by this catch block, and in the catch block we can handle the fetch failed dispatching fetch failed action. Now inside this we have to dispatch the action, but before dispatching, this is the response, not the actual data. To get the response, we need to parse into JSON. So for doing that, constant data is equal to yield, we have to just take response dot JSON, and then whatever the data that we get, we need to make another action, and that action will be listened by our reducer function. So just put an action with a type of fetch success. So this is going to be the another action which will be listened by our reducer function to just update the user the UI of our component, and then it is going to take something called payload, where we'll be passing the data, like how here I shown. So in fetch success, our async fetch user function, generator function, is going to yield or put this another action with the action name to be fetch success with a payload, so that the reducer listens to it. And let us head to reducer and try to create that over here. Now in the reducer, we have to listen to the first one, which is if action dot type is equal to fetch success, then in that case we have to return a state which is going to have all the state properties as it is, but API status set to be success. Okay, and then the data will be set to the payload of the action, so action dot payload. So whatever the one which we passed inside this put method, right, which has a type attribute as well as a payload attribute, this entire object will be eventually copied by captured by this action. And then in this action we are just based on the actions payload, we are setting as data, and we are returning it from this reducer method, so that whenever we return the statement, right, our user component listens to it, and it listens to this API status, which is success, and it also listens to this data, and data will be there. So when API status is success, then we'll have to show the data. Now let us come back to here, and then inside this, in the failure, we will dispatch another action. But one more thing is, before we need to yield it over here, because it's an asynchronous operation. Now here yield, and then I'm going to put another action which is fetch failed. So the type is going to be fetch failed. So whenever fetch is failed, we don't need to pass any payload, as you see here. Okay, when fetch is failed, we will take care of everything inside the reducer function. So here I'm going to write else if action dot type, if it is fetch failed, then we are going to listen to it, and then we return another object which will have state properties as it is, but with API status gets changed to error, and then we will be changing the error message to be something like something went wrong. Okay, now we listen to this one also. Now the last thing that we need to listen is whenever our async fetch watch user actions listens to this one, right? Immediately we need to set up our API status to be pending. I mean our API status to be loading. To do that, in this function we have to do that. So we have to yield and put another action which is having a type of fetching, and this is just to show the loading message, and then it will have no payload, and we will also listen to it. So else if action.type is equal to fetching. So inside this we are going to return the state object as it is, but we will be changing the API status from init to something like loading. Okay, so that API status, whenever listen to it, we can actually manage this API status loading inside our user component. Now that is all about this, nothing more. Now let us handle everything inside user component. So first thing is we have this fetch user method, and when it is in it, we are returning a button. But when it is success, right? So API status, or let's say when it is error, what we'll have to do? We'll have to return a message saying that return in the bold. We'll return the message of the error basically. So whatever the error that we are setting up here, right? Whenever fetch is failed, we are setting up error to be something went wrong. So this object I'm listening over here, and then this one I'll be just showing in the bold with a color of red. For that, let me just add a style to be a color of red, just like this. Now this is error thing, and this is the initial thing. Now we need to handle for the loading. So if API status is going to be loading, right? Loading, then we'll have to return a loading message. So we'll just set up a paragraph with a loading message, just like this. Now when everything is success, right, then in that case we'll have to display the data. So to display the data, what we will do is we will extract the fields first. So const email is equal to, we can just extract it something like this. If we head to over here, right, in this data structure, we can see first the object, the data object is actually has a property called results, and that is an array, and in that array there is an object. So let us capture that object. So let user is equal to the data dot results, and then in the results we'll have the zero index, and in that index we will just point to yeah, that's it. In this we'll point to that one, and then let us just extract the email first. So email is equal to user dot email simply, and then phone is equal to simply user dot phone, just like this. And then next thing is what else? Image is there. So image URL is equal to user dot pictures. So if you look at the bottommost, there is something called user.picture, not pictures, picture it is. So let me just remove that, and then inside that picture we are going to listen to the large one, so it is going to be large. Now once we get these three things, we also need to get the full name. So full name would be simply user dot the title of the person, which is user dot name dot title. So user dot name dot title, and that is Mr. or Miss, and then we will give a space, and then after that space we will take the first name as well as last name. So user dot name dot first plus another space, and user dot name dot last, something like this. And once we take all this, right, we will just display that onto the user, onto the UI. So I'll create a div for that, and let me set up an image with an src to be image URL, right? And then here is the image comes, and then full name I wanted to show, so that I'll show in the paragraph. So full name or something like, I'll just wave him hello, and then followed by the full name of the person. And then in the second thing I'll just give the email of the person, so email, and then a colon with the value of email. And then in another paragraph I'm going to just display the phone with a colon, and then the phone of the value of the particular phone. And then along with that, whenever I load a user, right, I have to call another function, right? I have to have another button which is used to load another user. So for doing that, let me just set up a function here, and inside this I'm going to show him saying that load another user, right? And inside this, upon clicking on it, again we are going to dispatch the same action which is there inside this fetch user method. So let me copy this method and then I'll pass this method for the onClick prop. So onClick, the same method that I'm going to give. Now whenever there is an error, right, we not only need to show this error message, but also we have to show the button for the try again. So let me just copy this, and then here I'm going to set up a div, and inside that the paste this, and then I'll add another button which on click I'm going to call the same fetch user. So fetch user will be called again, and inside this I'm going to set up try again. Let me just save it and let us head back to here. And now you see we have created it. So initially the status, API status is in it, so that's why we are able to see this button. And then whenever I click on it, what happens in the Saga, as we registered Saga here, which is this function that's going to listen to this fetch user event or action, and it's going to call this one. So once it calls this one, here the type fetching is been dispatched from here. So when fetching is dispatched, immediately reducer listens to it. So when it is fetching, right, what it will do, it will just change the API status from init to loading. When API status changes, this component re-renders, and when the component re-renders, now the status is loading. So we get this paragraph loading now, this time after clicking immediately. Now immediately what happens in the Saga, after yielding this, then it is going to make a API call, and in the API call, if it is success, then we are dispatching another action fetch success, so that the reducer listens to this fetch success, and it is going to change the API status from loading to success, and then data set to actions payload, which is the actual data that we received from the server. Now similarly, when there is a failure, then we are dispatching another action which is fetch failed. So in that case, this condition will be true, and then this time we are going to return API status to be error, which was loading previously. And then we set up some error message so that the component listens to it, and based on the conditions here, whether API status is error or whether API status is success. When the API status is success, the last one will render. When the API status error, then we are going to render this error message with red color and then a try again button. So eventually this is the application. Let me just save all this and let me click on this, and you see it is loading, and it just loaded up the data of the user, the image as well as the name of the person, and then email, and then the phone. And after that, here we had a button which is load another user, and the same button loaded. When I click on it, what will happen? It's going to dispatch another action which is again the fetch user, and again the same thing happens. So if I dispatch again, you see it is loading, and then it received the data and it loaded back. Let me click on again. This time we will be loaded with some other user. I hope you understand all this. I'll also try to keep the link of the GitHub link for this code. Thank you for watching.